Hello, everyone, and welcome to our moral psychology section. In this section, we're going to cover three specific areas: emotions, desires, and addiction. In the addiction section, we're also going to cover things like compulsion and temptation as well. Okay, so the first section then what we'll be looking at is emotion. And there's three theories of emotions that we'll be investigating. First is the James Lange theory, and there we'll be reading William James and Antonio Damasio. Next, we'll be looking at cognitivism, and we'll be reading Martha Nussbaum's first chapter in a book called Upheavals of Thought. And the third section, we'll be reading a perceptual-based model from Goldie. And it's very interesting as well. The perceptual-based model will be helpful in it when we, or the content you learn rather from the Goldie section will be directly related to one of the sections on desire, because one of the views in desire is called an evaluative perceptual view, and pretty much that's what Goldie's model has too. But for Goldie, Goldie thinks that emotions are these sort of value seemings or value to perceptions, and people like Graham Odie or Dennis Stamp or myself argue that emotions are so not emotions, but desires are some sort of value seeming, some sort of perception. My view is that desires are a something for someone to desire P is for that person to see P as good for his or her own well-being or something. So pay close attention when we get to Goldie and see how it applies to our desire section. All right, so let's turn to William James. William James flourished in the 19th century. He was well known for his work in psychology and in philosophy. He did start the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, and he's famous for his work in philosophy of religion, specifically with regard to religious experience. He wrote a book called Varieties of Religious Experience that's still read today in philosophy of religion programs. And if you get your PhD in philosophy of religion, for example, and you would take a 19th century qualifying or 20th century qualifying exam, you'll have to read William James, or a 19th century one as well. He also wrote lots of works on emotion and pragmatism as well. So, Will to Believe is his famous pragmatist treatise. He is famous for pragmatic theories of truth and different things like that. William James is a quite an influential thinker in the 19th and 20th century. All right, so let's turn to his theory on emotions then. So what I've done here is I've kind of chopped up different sections of the reading, and I'm hoping that this will help you to kind of guide you through his work, because it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. The first section here that I'm going to draw your attention to, it seems as if he is making a specific kind of argument in a deductive form. So it looks like something called like a constructive dilemma. So here he says, it's even now certain that two things concerning the emotions, one of them must be true, right? So then he sets up these two things. So here's his disjunctive in number one. One, either separate or special centers affecting them alone are their brain seat, or they correspond to processes occurring in the motor and sensory centers already assigned, or in others like them, not yet mapped out. Okay, sorry, a little bit of cold. All right, so then what he does is he pulls one of the disjuncts down in premise 2 there, and he gives you a conditional statement. So he says, if the former be the case, we must deny the current view and hold that the cortex to be something more than the surface of projection for every sensitive spot and every muscle in the body. to the latter be true, be the case rather, we must ask whether the emotional process, the sensory or motor centers, be an altogether peculiar one rather, or whether it resembles the ordinary perceptive process of which those centers are already recognized to be defeat. Then he tells you what his goal is going to be here. He says the purpose of the following pages is to show that the last alternative comes nearest the truth. And the emotional brain processes not only resemble the ordinary sensorial brain processes, but in very truth are nothing but such processes variously combined. So there is a view that's important for you to understand, and it's is popular among many psychologists, not all, certainly. And a real famous one is Paul Ekman. And this is the idea that emotions are hardwired into us to a certain degree. So there is a bit of emotions aren't an easy subject to handle. A lot of the psychological literature is very um, interesting and complicated and convoluted, but the evidence for a lot of the claims aren't as strong as we want them to be. So a lot of the experts in psychology are going to tell you to be open to new ideas and not be conformed to what the current fashions are in the field. But nevertheless, the view that it's popular, one of the views that's popular among thinkers who focus on emotion is the view that emotions are hardwired into us, um, and there's a standard universal set of emotions. James calls them standard. Later, like with Paul Ekman, they're called basic emotions. And then you'll see in Damasio, he calls them primary emotions. These are things like anger and disgust, happiness, sadness, surprise, and fear. And so this is the view that we have these basic emotions that are universal across all humans. I think I put a video up for you this week, though, that challenges this to a certain extent. This isn't. There is a lot of objection to this view. It seems as if language and culture and theories about how the mind works and how values work affects emotions significantly more than you would assume they would. Okay. So James goes on and he says, our natural way of thinking about these standard emotions, that is these basic ones, is that the mental perception of some fact excites the mental affection called the emotion, and that this later state of mind gives rise to a bodily expression. So he's saying, hey, the normal thing here is that, I see a bear, right? He uses a bear example in a few different writings. I see this bear. I see it, and then it scares me. And then what happens is I have this freak out bodily experience where my heart starts beating really fast. My stomach tenses up, right? I get flushed, red, I get really hot. He says that's a standard one, right? I see the bear, I get afraid, I have a bodily expression. James says this is wrong, people. My thesis, on the contrary, he says, is that bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, seeing the bear or something, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur. Is the emotion. So he's saying that you have the bodily sensation first, and your perception of the bodily expression. That is the emotion. That's the feeling. It's the experience of the bodily change. That's going to be his view, and we're going to see how this plays out. But the key point to notice here is that the emotion comes after the bodily expression. James says that one mental state is not immediately induced by another, that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we're sorry, angry, or fearful, as may be the case. Um, Without the bodily state following the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. We might see the bear and judge it best to run, receive an insult, deem it right to strike, but we cannot actually feel angry, afraid, or angry. So this is a look at what he's claiming here. You know the regular view is this, right? I am mad, so that's why I yell at someone, right? I am sad, and that's why I'm crying. But James saying, no, that's not right. What's going on is, look, you are sad because you're crying. You are angry because you hit someone. You're afraid because you're trembling. And so that's his view, right? And he also, so that's one view, right? And then the other thing he's claiming is very important for you to see is without the bodily state. So he's saying the bodily states are very important. Without the bodily state following the perception, all right, so the perception of the bear or something. The latter would be purely cognitive form. The emotion would just be cognitive, just be a thought, right? So imagine, I'm thinking about my cell phone right now. It's next to me. I see my phone. It's just a thought. I don't have any, there's no interesting connection to it, right? I'm looking out the window onto my side porch of my house, right? I don't have any sort of strong emotional connection there. I just see it, right? I'm pondering the history of fossil mind since Rene Descartes, right? These are just what he's calling purely cognitive forms, right? It doesn't have this emotional warmth to it. It's just an experience. And that isn't an emotion, he's claiming. You can't just have a thought. That can't just be an emotion. James says emotions are set up in this kind of dispositional, almost deterministic kind of way. James has a really precarious relationship with determinism. It's not straightforward what it's pretty straightforward what his view is, but it's hard to reconcile the view that he seems to assert with his stated view. And so I don't really want to get into too much about what he thinks about free will. But it does seem as if a lot of our states are determined by our biology, according to James. So James seems to think that our brains are set up to function in a really specific way, right? There's a pre-established response to set circumstances, and so we're disposed to act under certain manifestation conditions, right? So what does this mean? So in a disposition, like for example, if I have a vase is disposed to break easily. So if I knock the vase, then it will break, right? So it's a description of the disposition of the vase. The description is this: if I knock the vase over, it will break easily. Okay. The manifestation conditions of the disposition. The disposition, by the way, is a property that the vase has. Um, and without getting too much into how dispositions work, it is also a property that the surface has upon which the vase falls. But going back just to the relationship, the property of the vase has a specific property and it's called the disposition. And it, like I said before, the way you describe it is if I knock it over, then it will break. Okay. The manifestation conditions would be the conditions under which the vase manifested its disposition. And it manifests its disposition, namely when it falls and hits the floor, right? Okay. Uh, so our brains are set up to function in particular ways, and we have this property, this disposition in our brain, such that when we get under these certain circumstances, under different manifestation conditions, that we're going to act in a certain way. We're going to be disposed to behave a particular way. And here's some quotes for you. Excuse me. The neural machinery is but a hyphen between a determinate arrangement of matter outside of the body and a determinate impulse to inhibition or discharge within the organs. When the hen sees the white oval object on the ground, she cannot leave it. She must keep upon it and return to it until at last its transformation into a little mass of moving, chirping, blah 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 blah. The love of man for a woman, or a human mother for her babe, or our wrath at snakes, our fear may uh, may all be described in similarly as instances of the way in which particular uh, confirmed pieces of the world's furniture will fatally call forth most particular mental or bodily reactions in advance of, and often in direct opposition to, the verdict of deliberate reason concerning them. So what he's claiming here is that we have this certain setup within our psychologies, our brains, such that when we see something, like if a man loves a woman, then he'll behave a certain way. If a if a mother loves her child, then she'll behave a certain set of way. When we see a snake, we want to kill it, right? That's what he's claiming. And he goes on. He says every living creature is in fact a sort of lock. In other words, the springs presuppose special forms of keys, which keys, however, are not born attached to the locks, but are sure found in the world nearby as life goes on. And so he's saying we have these locks inside of us, and when we experience the world's like a key and unlocks us, and it elicits this emotion, which specifically is the perception or awareness of bodily motion, specific bodily emotions. All right. So this is a very interesting quote here, and I'm not going to read it to you, but this really resembles, it seems, is another argument for his view. And he's claiming, remember, that your emotions vary with these bodily experiences in this really specific and interesting way. He's claiming that your emotion is your awareness of a bodily state. Okay. So one of the ways he's going to do this is he's going to show you that the emotions vary along with the bodily states. So in some ways, the bodily states cause the emotion, to a certain extent. And to be honest with you, they're actually not causing the emotion. They're what we call constituents of it, or constituent causes. And we didn't cover constituent causes in our reading of causal literature, but something, if it's a constituent, it's a part of it. It's an essential. In this context, it's an essential part of it. So if the view then is that your awareness of this bodily change, of this bodily state, is an emotion. Then, if you have the bodily experience, then you also have that emotion, just so long as you're aware of it. So what he's claiming here then is that the emotions do vary along with these specific bodily states. And if you're interested, you could look it up here. When I copy and paste it, it looks as if there was a little error down there, so please forgive that. Okay. Now he emphasizes here that emotions are not judgments, and he's starting into this kind of subtractivism view, the subtractive argument that he does here, and he's really trying to say when you take away the body, the emotions go away. This you can think about this view when we talk about Martha Nussbaum's view next week. And the objection that James brings up here is an interesting objection that a lot of people actually bring up against what we call cognitive views of emotions, which are fairly appealing to a lot of people, and namely that they're too intellectualized. So I actually currently am in a debate with a philosopher at the Eastern European University about this topic right now. So she's thinking that Nussbaum's view is too intellectualized. I'm trying to convince her that it's not. Um, but let's look at James. Okay, let's turn into this. So this is still an ongoing debate. That's why I bring this up. All right. So James says an emotion cannot be a mere judgment. That's his view. And he says if we fancy some strong emotion, if we fancy it, and then we try to abstract from our consciousness all of it as the feeling of its characteristic bodily symptoms, We find we have nothing left behind, no mind stuff out of which emotion can be constituted, and that a cold and neutral state of intellectual perception is all that remains. Okay, so what does he mean by abstract? It means this to take away, to abstract, to subtract, right? To take it away. So consider some strong emotion like anger. Okay, then try to take away from it all of the consciousness of the feeling of its bodily symptoms. So when you're mad, right, you have this, your muscles tense, right, your heart rate goes, your face gets hot, right. You have to do something. You have to behave. And he says, take that consciousness of that feeling away, right, and then what's left? What do you have? You just have this real pale, boring thought that guy did something wrong, which doesn't seem to be anger at all, according to. And so he is going to claim, in this paragraph, he claims that the body is not just as important to emotions, but it is a necessary condition. It is a requirement for an emotion. And I think this is where I had this really good quote. He says, "It's true that although most people, when asked, say that their introspection, that's like their internal perception, verifies the statement, some persist in saying theirs does not. Many cannot be made to understand the question. When you beg them to imagine away, so here it is, imagine away every feeling of laughter and of tendency to laugh from their consciousness of the ludicrousness of an object, and then to tell you what the feeling of its ludicrousness would be like, whether it be anything more than the perception of the object belongs to a class funny, they persist in replying that the thing proposed is a physical impossibility and that they must laugh if they see a funny object." So he's claiming that if you try to subtract away the bodily response from the emotion, it's not physically possible. If I see something hilarious, right, I have to laugh. That's what he's claiming. And if you try to remove the laughing from that experience, then it's no longer humorous. It's no longer funny to you. All right. And so here is another argument that James gives that resembles Mill's method of difference. And he says this is a primary act, a speculative act of subtracting certain elements of feeling from an emotional state supposed to exist in its fullness, and saying that the residual elements are what the residual elements are. I cannot help thinking that all who rightly apprehend this problem will agree with the proposed proposition laid above. What kind of an emotion of fear would be left if the feeling neither of quickening heartbeat nor of shallow breathing, neither trembling lips or weakness of limbs, neither of goose flesh, things like goosebumps, nor of visceral stirrings were present, it's quite impossible to think. So again, he's saying if I try to, think of the situations in which I have the thought, that's dangerous, right? And then I have the experience, the emotion of fear. The ones in which I have the emotion of fear, I have this, trembling or whatever. And in the ones I just had that thought, I don't, right? I don't have that. And it's impossible to think that I have that emotion when I don't have these visceral stirrings or whatever. And again, this is more evidence. He gives more claims about how emotion dissociated from bodily feelings, is not conceivable. It talks about grief without tears, right? I guess this does make sense. Like imagine that someone really close to you died, right? Someone very important to you. And unfortunately, I know many of you probably have had this experience, but imagine, right, you've had this experience. You realize that this person died. You realize that he or she has been permanently removed from your life, right? And what that does to your sense of self and your circles of concern and how that relates to your whole life and who this person was to you and all that stuff. And it would be very difficult to be actually grieving the loss of someone that you love without having a strong emotional reaction, right? The suffocation, the heart. I think that's a wonderful way of explaining that grief, right? That the pang in the breastbone. That's exactly the way that feels, right? Sometimes not tears, but that suffocation that you feel over your chest, um, that deep, sharp pain in your chest, right? It's very difficult to imagine emotion of grief without these types of things. And James here is claiming that it's actually inconceivable. So he does bring up an objection to his own view, which I thought was good. And there are lots of objections to James's position. And one of the videos I put up for you, it's actually a video on the James Lange theory, and he does probably a better job than I'm doing now explaining it. But he brings up some more detailed objections, and I'm going to have time to do it for you. But I thought I'd provide it for you. So here's the one that James brings up. James says, but if emotion is nothing but a feeling of the reflex bodily effect of what we call its object effect due to the connate adaptation of the nervous system to objects that seems immediately face this objection. So what he's saying there in unclear language is that if emotion is nothing but the feeling of a bodily response, a specific one, right? These neurological ones he's talking about. And he actually doesn't think it's just the brain. James is very clear about this. It's not the brain, it's the body, it's the viscera. And so that he actually thinks it has to do with the heart and your lungs and your chest and your crying, these types of things, right? The tensing of your muscles and stuff. So he says, here's an objection my view will face. Most of the objects of civilized men's emotions are things which are learned over time, he's claiming. These are things that come along with convention, right? And they're learned and so for the social environment. Um, he says, same is true of matters of dread and desire and many other melancholy and regret. In these cases, at least, it would seem that the ideas of shame, regret, desire must first have attached to education and association to these conventional objects before bodily changes could possibly be awakened. And if in these cases the bodily changes follows the idea instead of giving rise to them, then why not in all cases? Um, so his idea, what he's worried about here, or he probably has heard people make this objection, is that like say an emotion like shame, okay, it really does seem as if shame has to be some sort of second order, or guilt at least has to be some second order emotion to learn it, right? Like Jean Paul Sartre, he has a real beautiful way of explaining, not beautiful at all actually, but it's very insightful way of talking about shame. And it really seems as if you need another person, he called it the other, to experience this emotion, it's a social emotion, in Damasio's terms. It's not just Damasio, but he's the one reading. So anyway, um, so he says, imagine you're peering through this peek hole, spying on people, having a private exchange. And then someone creeps up behind you, or not creeps up, someone comes upon you and looks at you, and then all of a sudden your attention is removed from being as the creepy peeper looking through the peephole to recognizing that you are being observed, right? Which is the shame. And so there has to be some sort of learning there, right? And also it just seems as if you have to know some other things have other types of emotions. And remember James's view is this sort of basic emotions view, specifically the view that you that these emotions are hardwired into us in a particular way. Remember he talked about the disposition and the keys, like so you have a lock in you, and these emotions are dispositional in your body such that when the manifestation the conditions occur, right? Like I see someone that I dislike or something, then I become frustrated or irritated, right? And that kind of unlocked that emotion, that the physical response in me. So I have this physical visceral response, right? My body tenses up, my heart rate goes, increases rather, and and then I haven't experienced that feeling. Um, so that's his view, right? So it's kind of universal. But if the idea is that you have to learn content first before you can have these kinds of emotions, then his view it doesn't go through, right? But James doesn't think that will work. He says, regardless of if you had to learn information before you have these bodily responses, the emotion itself is just the feeling of the bodily response. All right. So he says it doesn't matter how you got the bodily response. It might be that you can have more sophisticated thoughts about emotions that are given by that are that allow that are assisted through or aided through education, but nonetheless, um, emotions are still caused by a bodily response in me, and of which I perceive, and then the emotion occurs, right? And so he says it doesn't matter if we have to learn something first, because the emotion is the feeling or perception of the bodily response. Remember his claim: I am not angry because I do not clench. I do not strike because I'm angry. I'm angry because I strike. Right? I don't cry because I'm sad. I'm sad because I'm crying. Right? So he switches that perception there. All right, so so this is basically the summary of his view, and I've kind of explained it to you several times, so I'm not going to go into it too much depth here, but this is kind of a nice, quick summary statement of his position that I'll let you read. But James's view has been really influential, and it does have its objectors, and it's not really well, it doesn't have a huge reception nowadays. And there are some good objections to it, to be honest with you. I mean, one of the objections that I like is the objection that your bodily responses. There's two. One, that your bodily responses there aren't enough of them to elicit all the complex emotions we have. So we don't have the set of autonomic nervous system responses that we have available to us aren't various enough to allow for the radical different types of emotions we have. So it doesn't seem as if the biology that James is appealing to really will match will be vary along with emotion states we have. Another thing that I think is a big problem with James's view is that a lot of the bodily responses, and this bears out, you see this a lot in a lot of literature about emotions and the problems with facial expressions and emotions. Because Paul Ekman, for instance, is real famous for connecting basic emotions with specific facial expressions and micro expressions and things like that. And so the problem is that we are okay at reading these things, but it turns out we're not as good at reading them as we thought we were, and you have all kinds of issues, right? That come wrong, like justice issues and stuff like that. But my point is that the feeling of anger that James describes, right? Like your heart starts pounding. He talks about like your bowels, you tense up or something like that. You feel flushed and hot, right? It sounds to me like that's the flu, right? Not anger. Or, maybe it's anger, but if I'm perceiving my body to feel like that, I don't know why I'm not thinking that I have a flu. Why don't, as opposed to I'm angry. So it doesn't seem as if the perception or the feeling of this bodily state is really good enough. It's not sufficient to, or necessary or sufficient for the emotion that is responding to. And it seems like a lot of the bodily states you're in when you have a positive emotion are going to be similar to the ones that you have when you have a negative emotion. And so this mere perception of these bodily states is not going to be enough to elicit the variegated emotions that we have. Now, luckily for James lovers, there is a new fella in town. He's not actually new. He's Antonio Damasio, Tony Damasio. He's at USC. He is one of these fancy guys. He like teaches in 3 different departments at least. Psychology, philosophy, and neurology. He has an MD and a PhD. I don't know what his PhD is in. I tried to look it up, but I gave up because I didn't care that much. But nonetheless, he's written lots in philosophy. He's written in neurology and psychology. He was a practicing neuroscientist and psychiatrist. He's a brilliant man. Um, he's extremely open-minded as well. Um, I tend not to like his views, but he's really good. And so, whenever if he writes something, it's definitely worth listening to. Though you might disagree with him, but you can kind of see where he's coming from. So he's a real interesting character. He did write a book called Descartes' Error, and he did, I think, and not just my view, but my doctoral advisor Patricia Easton, she was, or one of my doctoral advisors, she's a Descartes scholar, and she says that he got Descartes wrong, and so I'd probably go with Patricia before I go with Tony, Antonio. But nonetheless, he is a one. He's a gifted scholar, um, and so he's worthwhile reading. So let's dive into Damasio's view. So Damasio brings up a couple terms that you'll need to know, and I brought these up earlier when we were talking about James. But Damasio says, look, there's these primary or universal emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, surprise, anger, disgust. There's also secondary or social emotions, he claims: embarrassment, jealousy, guilt, or pride. Guilt's a complicated one. I'm not sure if that would be social, but who cares? That's his view. Um, um, yeah, I can't go into why, but Friedrich Nietzsche has a really interesting position on guilt. I think he kind of gets some of it right. Like guilt might be something more like self-directed anger or something like that. But it'll be secondary in some way. In Damasio's way, it'll be secondary. Nonetheless, Damasio also talks about these background emotions, and these kind of seem he wants to claim these are different than moods. A mood is going to be like a longer lasting type of thing. See, background emotions don't need a specific object, but but they're not going to be as long lasting as other as moods. So background emotions, I think they can think of them in terms of moods. I think that'd be right. The difference between a mood and a emotion is that a mood is an effective judgment or perception or something like that that doesn't have an object, right? So, for example, the difference between anxiety, being stressed, or being anxious and having anxiety, right? One might be like, I'm anxious about my exam coming up, right? So I'm worried about my exam. I'm nervous about it. I'm anxious about it. And the other one would be just like, I'm just anxious. I don't know why. I'm just anxious. And so the one that I don't know why, I'm just anxious, that's your background emotion in Damasio's terms, or a mood, which is the term I prefer. But so malaise, right? So malaise is a indication of depression. It's not always, but it's this feeling like you're sick, you're tired. It's like, when you have the flu and you just can't get out of bed, you're so tired, you just feel like junk, right? You just feel so icky, and that's malaise. But if you have malaise and you don't have the flu, then you might need a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, right? You might not have enough serotonin going on. So malaise then is this background emotion, um, and it has these real interesting physical effects. Okay, let's move on. So Damasio claims that there's a shared biological core that underlies all the phenomenon, and it can be outlined in this way. So he says emotions are complicated collections of these chemical and neural responses that form specific patterns and help us to organize our life and maintain homeostasis and things like this. The emotions are biologically determined processes, and they depend on these innately set brain devices. So this is a key phrase here: innately set. So think that keys, like when the locks, rather, in James's terms of locks, right? These are innate. Innate means because of what you are. So, like, there's the early modern philosophers brought up something called innate beliefs. Well, they didn't bring them up, rather. The rationalists are popular for discussing them. So an innate belief would be something like, I believe food goes in my mouth, not in my elbow, right? Or I know that I believe 2 plus 2 is 4 or something. So innate is an innate belief is something you believe because of what you are, not because of what you've learned. And so if you have an innate brain device, that's something that a brain device that you have because of what you are, because evolution has, or it comes along with our species because of the way we've evolved. So that's what he's claiming here. He claims next, the devices which produce emotions are fairly restricted in some sort of cortical regions, beginning with the level of the brainstem and moving up to higher brain. So he's a neurologist, so some of this was slightly brain heavy talk, but he's trying to explain that there's various kinds of brain devices and regions and patterns that are involved in emotions. And he says all the devices can be engaged automatically without conscious deliberation. Okay, so all of a sudden you should have this. You need to be aware of this, right? What number 4 is important. He's saying that emotions aren't conscious all the time. Okay, but remember James doesn't, right? James says that emotion is the awareness of the bodily response. Okay, these emotions to Damasio don't have to be conscious. So all emotions use the body as their theater, okay, internal milieu. So that's important for you to understand. Like they include all these. The body is the theater where it occurs, right? But emotions, he says, also affect the mode of operation of certain brain circuits. So the variety of emotional responses is responsible for a profound change in both the body landscape and the brain landscape. The collection of these changes constitute the substrate, that is that upon which, for the neural patterns which eventually become the feeling of emotion. Okay, so that phrase, the feeling of emotion, is super important to Damasio, because an emotion for him is something that goes on, and it can be not. It doesn't need to be felt. Okay, you don't need to be experiencing it, which James wouldn't agree with, I don't think. Right. Um, as for James, remember, if I'm actually grieving, if I'm actually sad, then I need to have that experience of my bodily state, right? But for Damasio, he's saying, look, there's feelings of emotions. There's knowledge of your feeling of emotion, okay? And so that's going to be a different. And Damasio has an interesting way of going about it. Okay. So he says, look, there's the biological function of motion is two. First, the production of specific reactions to the inducing situation. So it's important for you to understand some of these psychological terms. So in emotion theory, in emotional psychology, the psychology related to emotions, there's induction, there's inducing. You want to know how to induce certain emotions. And in some of the lectures I'll put up, you can find links to quick interviews with experts in emotion. The experts in emotion interviews are helpful. I would suggest you watch them. And they talk about induction of emotions, like why. You might want to know, why are we talking about causing emotions? Well, because the causal pattern of an emotion is going to be very helpful in figuring out what the emotion is, what the emotion's about. So, the first, you have the induction situation, fight or flight. If I come, someone's trying to punch me, right, and I'm afraid, I'm angry or whatever. Second, the regulation of the internal state of the organism such that it can be prepared for a specific reaction. So what happens, all of a sudden, someone's going to punch me. Oh, increase blood flow through arteries and legs and muscles so I can get extra oxygen and glucose in case I need to run away, right? the biological purpose for emotions is just survival, he claims. But we don't just want to have a non-conscious state of our emotions, right? We need to have consciousness of emotion is so much better than emotion just itself, okay? Because the consciousness of emotion will allow me to be aware of a more variety of experiences in the world. It will help me to point out certain things. That's Damasio's view. Now, I personally don't know if this makes much sense or not. I mean, I can see why we would want to say that. So the question is, why have we evolved in such a way where we're conscious of our environment? It seems as if we are disposed to behave in a certain way, I will run away from the lion, right? Even if I'm unconscious of the lion. And I think that's true. And Damasio seems to think that, well, he doesn't seem to think, he states it in some of his videos that I'm having you watch. He just states that, being aware of that lion is going to enable you to survive better than if you weren't. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I could see that there is a case for it, of course. Anyway, so consciousness allows feelings to be known and thus promoted the impact of emotions internally. Allows emotions to permeate through the thought process, through the agency of feeling. So, I'm afraid, oh my gosh, I'm going to run away, right? So not only does the consciousness of the feeling of the emotion allow you to pay attention to your environment better, but also it interacts with your thought processes, and it does that so through the agency of feeling, right? So consciousness makes the emotion the object of consciousness. Okay, so I have an emotion. Remember, these emotions for Damasio are just specific neurological and visceral responses. So he's not so naive to think that emotions are just in the brain. Okay, emotions occur. The biological structure of emotions isn't just in your brain. Okay, so you really need to get out of that sort of 20th, this 1900s, 1800s, or more like 1900s, 20th century view of neurology or psychology, and it's not just the brain. Your biological uh, mechanisms that are involved in emotion have to do with your central nervous system as well as the rest of your body. And so that's important for you to understand. Damasio is very clear about this. Um, so your emotion for him is this biological response, but then consciousness makes you aware of the emotion such that that biological or neurological response is the object of consciousness, and it represents emotions as a feeling. Okay, so Damasio I have this view that emotions are representations of this internal process neurological biological process that's going on, and that representation is the feeling of the emotion. Okay, it's like a painting of the emotion. That's the way he talks about it. All right, let's see. All right, here we are. The mechanism of motion. So I've kind of chatted about this a bit, but he says there's no single brain center for the processing of motion. There's a discrete system related to separate emotional patterns. So that's important to know. So he's not so naive to think it just happens in one spot, people, right? The brain induces emotions in a small number of brain sites. And so it happens in a variety of locations and different patterns. So he thinks there's three steps in this process. So one is the engagement of the organism by an inducer of the emotions, so something scary or something. The signals consequent to the processing of the object's image activated all the neurological sites that are prepared to respond to particular cases of the inducer. So think of this as kind of the locks and keys and how that works out in James's view, which the object belongs. So the amygdala with anger, with fear rather, and anger too. The brain stem, having presently innately, blah blah blah. Okay. Oh, here's for the past. oh, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Sites which include the ventromedial prefrontal cortices, the amygdala, and the brainstem have present innately, but past experiences with things has modulated the manner in which they are likely to respond. For instance, the ease of which they will respond. All right, so the next step is, as in the result of number 2, step 2, emotion induction sites trigger a number of signals toward other brain sites. And so you have this interaction between this inducer of the motion from outside. Then you have this act that interacts, then the as you are processing that information, it interacts with specific neurological features, sites rather, and those interact with another of other sites and trigger other signals to your other areas in your brain and toward your body, the viscera, endocrine glands, and things like that. This step, the process of 1 to 3, is a collection of responses to the circumstances causing the whole entire emotion, right? So this is the emotion. It's this engagement with the world, as in Robert Solomon's terms, um, in a different way than Solomon means it. By the way, we're not reading him, but it's this engagement. It's an interaction with the world, right, that causes a neurological response, and that neurological response is going to involve other neurological and biological responses, somatic responses. Soma in Greek means body, so somatic responses, and this is going to be the emotion. Okay. Then there's consciousness and emotion. So emotions cannot be known to the subject, having them before there is consciousness. He has this quote here. He says, "We know that we have an emotion when the sense of a feeling self is created in our minds. Until there is a sense of a feeling self in both evolutionary terms as well as developing individual, there exists a warm, well-orchestrated response, which constitutes emotion." Okay, this well-orchestrated response constitutes the emotion, he says, and ensuring the brain responses which constitute a feeling. Okay, so then we get the feeling, the certain brain responses that those constitute a feeling, but that's different than the emotion. But we only know that we have an emotion when we sense an emotion is sensed as happening in ourselves, in our organism. So he has the view of the proto-self. He has this view of this the concept of the self. And you have to, in order to have emotion, you have to have this, he thinks. Okay, so there's a relationship between emotion and representation, which I've talked to you about before. It's really important to Damasio's view. He says the emotion is something that happens unconsciously. Actually, this isn't him. This is me right now. When we feel the emotion, we represent the biological structure, and this is knowing or being aware of the emotion. So that's his view. Okay, that's my summary of his view. So you have an emotion unconsciously, and when we feel the emotion, we are representing this biological structure, and this is becoming aware of the emotion. Okay. The emotion as object comes from representing the activity patterns and induction sites of the emotion. And then he has these set of claims here. I propose one: the inaugural proto-self is represented at the second order level. So a first order, second order distinction is something like, I believe that there's a jacket on the back of the chair. All right, and then a second order belief would be something like, I believe that I am currently believing that there's a jacket on the chair. So it's a belief about a belief, or a desire. So I want ice cream, and a desire. You could have second order desires. I desire that I don't desire the ice cream. Right. So that's the view. So it has to happen at the second order level. This, you have a self, but then you have a concept of the self is a second order issue. It's a thought about a thought about the self, right? The object that is about to change, the proto self, that changing self, the neural activity pattern and emotion induction sites, is represented at the second order level and assures changes in the proto self, acting by body loop, or as if body loop mechanisms are represented in second order. What is he saying here, right? What he's claiming here is that in order to know you have an emotion, you have to have some sort of proto self concept, and I don't think that he's so naive to think that animals can't have this. But certainly the human proto self is going to be more sophisticated than a non-human animal proto self. The proto self, the concept, the self here we're talking about isn't some sort of enduring self. It's this concept of self. It's like thinking of seeing yourself as the object of consciousness, or being aware that you are there, right? So that, you could be aware of pain. You could be in pain, but may not be aware that you're aware of the pain, right? You might not be thinking, "Ow, I am in pain," but you might be in pain, right? So there's a difference there. You can be in pain and aware that you're in pain, right? Those are different things. And here he's talking about this uh, treating yourself as the object of consciousness. He says, look, there's like a body loop that goes on, and he says it uses both the humoral signals and the neural signals. And as a result, both types of signals, the body landscape is changed and is subsequently represented in somatosensory structures of the central nervous system from the brainstem up as in an as if body loop. Okay, so what does this mean, right? So you have to remember these different steps that I showed you. He's talking about in his paper. What he's trying to say is, look, you have this signal from the outside, and it prompts a certain neurological and somatic response. Okay, this neurological and somatic response interact with each other in a very specific, in a various and specific biological neurological patterns. Okay, and then that's your body loop. Okay, that's your body loop. That does this interactions loop, this biological, uh, humoral, and neural signaling. Okay, so this is the biological. This is an emotion. It's a substrate of the emotion. Okay, but then there's something like that he calls the as-if body loop, and this the change in representation of the body landscape can be partly achieved by another mechanism he calls the as-if body loop. This is the representation of the representation of the bodily related changes of sensory body maps and the control of other neural sites. So what he's saying here is, like, you can have this as if body loop, and this as if body loop is going to be like a representation of what goes on in the body loop. So it doesn't have to actually happen. It's more of like he wouldn't say it like this, okay? So he really wouldn't put it like this, but it's kind of like a memory of what happens in your body loop. He would not say it like that, and that's technically incorrect, but I want to start there, right? So if I have a memory of something that went on in my life, right, I can think about it, and I can imagine it as if it was actually going on. But the as if body loop is different than that. The as if body loop is another sort of set of neurological signalings. But the set of neurological signalings to Damasio is a representational structure. And what the heck does that mean, right? That representational structure, it's like a painting of the body loop. Okay, so that the substratum of the emotion that's being represented in your as if body loop. So he says, for instance, in the prefrontal cortices, it is as if the body has really been changed, but it hasn't. Okay? The as if body loop mechanism bypasses the body proper, partially or entirely, and the as if mechanisms are not only important for emotion and feeling, but are also a class of cognitive processes that might designate as internal stimulation. Okay, so here's like a statement of his theory. Okay, the simplest definition of emotion as specifically caused transient change of an organism state corresponds a simple definition for feeling of emotion. It is the representation that transient change in an organism state is in terms of neural patterns and ensuing images. When these images are accompanied one instant later by a sense of self in the act of knowing, and when they are enhanced, they become conscious. They are, in a true sense, feeling of feelings. And how does this work? The first order neural maps in both the subcortical and cortical regions represent the changes in the body state. regardless of whether they were achieved through the body loop or in the as-if body loop or a combination of mechanisms. The feeling emerges. You have this first-order neurobiological map in a subcortical and cortical region. The pattern of neural activity at the emotion induction site also is mapped in a second-order neural structure. The protoself is altered because of these events. The changes in the protoself are also mapped on a second-order neural structure, and the account of the foregoing events depicting the relationship between emotional object, the activity at the emotional induction site, and the protoself is organized in a second-order structure. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, so you have these neurological maps, okay, and he calls them body maps as well. And these neurological maps or structures are going to be the motions themselves. Okay, but the thing is that you can know you have the emotion when you have this awareness of yourself undergoing this change. And this awareness of yourself, he's calling that proto-self. And I kind of I feel him on this one, right? Like it seems as if your self changes fairly significantly, and it's interesting. A really complicated moral psychological question is why is it that um, things affect you in certain ways, right? Like why uh, if someone is that you love leaves you, why does that hurt so much? Or if someone that you love wants to be with you, then that makes you have so much joy, right? Or someone because you have on a freeway it makes you angry, right? Why does this happen? And the thing is, it's unclear. Or another interesting one is like issues with attachment, right? Like if someone that you don't know dies, like you could be sad about it, but it would really be odd to say you're grieved about it. But if your mother died and say you're close to her, it would be odd to say that you're just sad about it, but it would be perfectly right to say you were grieved about it, yeah? And so the question is like, how does this relate to yourself? And it seems as if it might involve what I call a concept of yourself. And this concept of yourself is a way that you see yourself, and yourself is connected to other people and other things in your life. And so when something interacts with when you form an attachment to someone else or something else, and that's either affirmed or denied, it's going to relate to your sense of self. And uh, when that happens, then you will have this either removal, it's a kind of a pulling away, a discordant, like some sort of discord in your uh, uh, sense of self, or a taking away of your sense of self, and so you won't have this really pure, safe sense of self anymore. And so this is kind of what he's talking about here with I think this is kind of what he's getting at with the proto-self. I think it'll probably be different than my view, but it's the same kind of concept. I think you have, when I have an experience of some sort of event, it's going to interact with me in a particular way and cause this neurological set of events, this neurosomatic set of events. And then what's going to happen there is it's going to be mapped. Then I'm going to have this second order process, the second order set of mapping about that map of one set of internal responses to an external stimuli. And then I have another set of internal responses to that internal mechanism, right? So someone cuts me off the freeway, it causes a bunch of neurological patterns, say. But then I have another set of neurological patterns, and this other set of neurological patterns involves me representing this first one, okay? And the me representing the first one is that proto-self, that I see it as this. And so the emotional object then is the activity at the emotion induction site. The proto-self then is organized in a second order structure as I see it as this, right? And so Damasio's view then, put simply, is that something causes your body and brain to have specific responses. That then you have another set of neurological patterning that mirrors, okay, this body loop, that mirrors this neurological pattern that was caused by someone cutting off a freeway. But this secondary structure, the secondary organization, involves what he's calling your proto-self, and it's second order because the set of neurological mirroring neurons are going to be about the first order ones. So you're representing then, you're painting a picture, he claims, of the first level of neurological activity. That first level of neurological activity, that first level is the emotion. The second level is like your feeling of the emotion, which involves then your proto-self. And at that point, then you can know that you have that emotion because you can feel the feeling. All right, well, I hope this was helpful for you. I know that these two views, the Damasio's view at least, is fairly complicated. And all right, I look forward to seeing what you all think about it.